this video, we're going to be creating an authentication system. So we're going to be creating registration forms, the registration functionality, the ability to connect to the database, and also a way for the user to log in once they've been registered. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to set up Codeigniter 4, which is the latest stable release of Codeigniter in WAMP server. Now usually I wouldn't recommend that we use WAMP, the only reason being that a server that we've set up using Vagrant can or is more likely to mirror what would actually be on our live server. So in this case we're going to use WAMP, the only reason again being is because it's easy to install, it's easy for you to get set up at home. So you'll see on the screen just now, what I've got open is the Codeigniter GitHub page. Now the reason why I've got GitHub open is because the Codeigniter website is currently down at the moment. But also what we're going to do is we're going to look for the latest stable release. So you'll see here that we have what's called a final release. Final release just means that that's safe for us to use on a production website. Codeigniter and the team will still continue to do updates to Codeigniter, but this is something that we can use in a production environment, which is what we want. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded this, so you can do that by clicking just source code here. And then you'll see that it downloads fairly quickly, and it's not very big, it's a nice lightweight framework at just 3.7 megabytes in a zip folder here. Okay, so we'll just minimize this and you'll see I've got this on my desktop. I'm going to open up this folder, bring it across onto the screen that's actually recording, and inside there you'll see that there is a Codeigniter 4 folder. If I open that up, I've got a bunch of files in here, and what I'm going to want to do is grab all of these and I'm going to pop them into the WAMP folder. So the WAMP folder is located in the C drive. It's in a WAMP 64 folder if you install the 64-bit version, otherwise it will be in WAMP 32 if you've got the 32-bit version. Inside there's a www directory, and then inside here what I'm going to do is create a new folder for my project. So in this case I'm just going to call it website. Inside there, what I can now do is just extract all of these files straight into there. So this should only take a couple of seconds, and once extracted we've pretty much got our base application for Codeigniter. So I'll show you what that looks like in our browser in a second once this is finished extracting. Okay, so that's it all done. So now if I pop into my browser, remember WAMP is located at localhost, so I'm going to type in http://localhost, and then / the folder that I created previously, where I placed Codeigniter, which is website. Okay, and in here what you can see is I've got the base of my Codeigniter install. So once I've got everything extracted into that folder, what I'm going to do is select everything. I'm going to unselect the public folder. I'm going to cut this. I'm going to go back a directory into www, and I'm going to paste everything into there. So once that's done, what I'll do is pop back into my website folder. I'm going to go into the public folder, and I'm going to move everything from here just back one directory into website. And I'm going to delete that public folder. Okay, now this will form the basis of our website. So when I visit my browser, what I should get now when I refresh the website is the Welcome to Codeigniter screen, which shows that Codeigniter is running how we'd expect it to. Now from this point, what I'm going to do is just show you some of the core folders. So the folders you'll already be aware of, hopefully. But if I pop back into www, you can see I've got my app folder, which has controllers. It has models, and it also has views. So these are the key folders that we're going to be working in. So one of the things to remember is that Codeigniter is MVC based, which means it's models, views and controllers. So we're going to be using those properly to develop our application. So now that we're here and we have our application set up, the next thing we're going to do is just create a database for our Codeigniter 4 app. So to do that, and because we're using WAMP again, what we can do is create a new browser tab. We can go to localhost /php myadmin. Visit that site, we'll get a simple login screen. So this is based on your machine just now. In the username we need to enter the password root, so ROOT, and then we can leave the password blank. So this is unsecure, but again we're just developing locally at the moment, so if you were going to put this onto a live server, you'd be looking to secure MySQL and changing that password from being blank to a secure password. You'd also look to disable your root account, but in this case what we're going to do is we're going to create a new database, and that database is going to be for application. So we're going to start by clicking on databases. We're then going to give our database a name, so we're going to call it website, which just links in with how we'd set it up earlier, and we're just going to click create. Now that is now our website database created, so you can see that on the left hand side here. Now we can continue to create tables in here, but what I'm going to do instead is show you how to set up MySQL Workbench with this. Setting up MySQL Workbench is quite simple, so what I'll do is I'll pop a link to the installation at the bottom of this video. But once you've got it installed, if you open it up, so MySQL Workbench, once it's open, you'll see something which looks like this. Now to add a new connection, we're going to use this plus symbol here, so we can click that plus. We're going to leave everything exactly the same because again we're using an unsecured WAMP server, so we don't need to make any special changes here. We're just going to give our connection a name, so something we can remember. So I'm just going to call it localhost. And then I'm going to click test connection. It does give us a warning. This is just because of the way that WAMP's set up. We can continue anyway, and you'll see that we get a successful connection made with a MySQL server. Clicking OK, and then OK again, means that we then get the connection set up on the right hand side here inside our MySQL Workbench. Clicking that will now connect to our server, and again we can check this don't show this message again and click continue anyway to ignore that error. Now on the left hand side we can now see our database showing up here. Remember we called it website when we created it earlier. Now the first thing we're going to do is right click on that and click set as default schema, and you can see it turns into bold. Now the reason we do this is because now when we carry out any MySQL commands, they're going to be carried out on this database only and not any other database that we have there. Now it's not too important at this stage because we have one database and a test one there that's ready for us when we first use the WAMP server. However, if we're using a live server, that's mega important because you could end up carrying out MySQL commands on an incorrect database. So we're going to start our application by creating a user login system. So that's going to allow us to not only register users but also allow them to log in and view some protected pages. So the first thing we're going to do is create the table that's going to house that information. So in MySQL Workbench you can see a tables tab here. If we click on that and then right click and select create new table, we're going to create a table and I'm going to call it users. Inside here I'm going to add some columns. So the first one's going to be user ID. This is going to be our primary key. It's going to not be null, and it's also going to auto increment. So that means as we add more users, the ID is going to go up. So in this case, first user is going to be 1, second user is going to be 2, third user 3, and so on. I'm also going to add in a username because I want them to log in with a username. Now I'm going to extend the length of this to about 100. That does seem a bit excessive at this stage, but it may be that we'll have issues later on down the line if we do allow email addresses or something else like that. We're also going to add in a password. Okay, and this field I'm going to set as text. Now the reason why I'm setting this as text is because we're going to be encrypting the password at some stage, so it needs to be able to install that encrypted password. If we look at a standard encrypted password, it may be that it's more than 255 characters in length, so we could actually use what's called a varchar. So we could use a varchar, but the maximum length that field would allow is 255, which is why we're going to use text, because we can go over that 255 character limit. So again, we're going to pop this back as text. Once we're happy that our database is there, I'm also going to set these as not null because we need a username and a password to log in. I'm then going to click apply down here. That will give me the MySQL, so it's good practice to have a look at this because you should be able to write MySQL at some point in your career if you're going to start becoming a developer. But either way, this is written for us. I can now click apply, and you can see that the SQL script was successfully applied to the database. clicking finish will just close this window, and I'm happy now that my table is in place. So again, I can expand this tables tab here and you can see that my users is there. Now if I right click this table, I can select to view the table data. So if I click select rows at the top here, and you can see here there are no users set up just now. Now we're going to use our application to set up these users. So the next step in this whole process is to create our controller. Now our controller is going to deal with the request which is made by the user to log in or register. So the first thing we're going to do is pop back to our app folder. So in WAMP64, www and then app, we're going to go inside the controllers folder. Inside there we'll see that there's a home and also a base controller. We're going to copy the home controller by pressing Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and you'll see I've now got a copy of this file. I'm going to rename that to Authentication, because this is going to deal with all of our authentication in our application. So authentication means logging in, registering, logging out, anything to do with the user being able to access the system. Once I've renamed that file, one important thing to note is it does need to have a capital letter at the start of the name. I'm going to edit that file in Notepad or a similar text editor. And if I just zoom this in a tiny bit, what you'll see is I now have a class called home, which extends the base controller. We're not going to worry too much about that just now, but we are going to change where it says home to match this name here. So it should be Authentication, again with that uppercase A at the start of the name. Now following on from that, what you'll see is we have an index function. So let me just show you how this works in the browser. So if I pop back into my browser, I'm going to close this tab for now because I don't need phpMyAdmin anymore. I'm going to go back to my Welcome to Codeigniter 4. Now this is a subfolder at the minute, so this is website. So on a live site we wouldn't have this, we just have our .co.uk where localhost is, or something similar. So after this main URL, so this would usually make up your main URL, so for example developerspace.co.uk, this / is now going to form the controller name, so in this case Authentication. So if I visit Authentication in the browser, see that nothing really happens, but the reason why is because I've used the same template file. So the next step for us is to change this template file so that it displays us a login screen. So in order to change that view, what I'm going to do is pop back to my desktop, and then you'll notice that from the first intro to Bootstrap tutorials we'll have this website folder here. Now inside here, if I just pop inside there, bring it back onto this screen, I've got now a login form. So if I just open that up in Chrome, so we're using the same browser, you can see this is my login screen now. So I've got the application login, I've got a username and password field, and also a sign in button. So if we just have a quick peek at the code of that file, so sorry, we'll go back into here and we're just going to edit that in Notepad++. You can see it's just a standard HTML file with some CSS in there and also my custom style sheet. So custom here and the standard Bootstrap style sheet. So if I just close that for a second, what we're going to do is now pop this into our Bootstrap directory on our WAMP server. So what I'm going to do first of all is grab CSS, JS, and also this logo file here, which is just the Bootstrap logo. And I'm going to copy those. And then what I'm going to do is pop back into my WAMP folder, so WAMP64, into www, and then into my website folder here. Now inside here, what I've got is my index.php file, which is the main file for the website, and I'm going to pop all these resources in here now as well. So I should now have CSS, JS, and also my Bootstrap logo. Once I've done that, what I can do is then go back into my www folder, into app, and then into views, because this is where we're going to start to add our template files. So remember, a view shouldn't have too much PHP or any sort of programming logic in there. It should just be something you're going to display a user on the screen. So if I just pop in a template file in here, so going back to my website folder, I'm going to grab this login.html file, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it straight into the views folder. Now at the minute we can see that's a HTML file. So the first thing I need to do with that is actually change the file extension to PHP. Now the computer has prompted me to change the file extension. It's saying, do I want to change this? And it might become unusable. that's just a warning. It's not going to become usable because we've not done anything special with it. Now what we can see is this login file has now become a PHP file. There's no PHP in there at the minute, but what this does mean is that I can now add PHP if I need to. Now this is a requirement of Codeigniter. It requires those to be PHP files, whether we're using HTML or we're using PHP. They should all be PHP files, which is why I've done that. Now at the moment, what I've got on here is just a file called login.php. And if we pop back to my controller, which I've got in the background here, you can see that I'm returning what's called a view. Now again, a view just comes from model view and controller. So a view is something that the user's going to see on the screen. Now looking at this, I've got something called welcome_message in that. Now what I'm going to do is just change this to login. Now the important thing to remember here is I do not need to have a file extension there, so it doesn't need to be called login.php, but this essentially is mapping with that login PHP file that we just created. So this will now return the login.php file for us onto the screen. So if I save that, I'm going to pop back to my browser and I'm going to go back. I'm going to close this tab first of all actually. I'm going to go back to my Welcome to Codeigniter page. You can see I'm in the Authentication controller. So if I refresh that, we can now see my login screen. So that's now part of my application. Now going back to controllers just to give you a demonstration of how these actually work. So at the minute I'm in the Authentication controller, which is indicated by this bit I've highlighted just here. If I pop back into my controller code, what you can see is I've got a function here called index. So if I go to my browser, I'll show you how this bit works here. I go into my browser and put /index. So if I now just go into the address bar, so remember this is our controller name, I'm going to put /index onto the end and press enter. And that's going to load the exact same login view, bar we've got the icon missing just here, so we'll just go in quickly and repair that. So we're going to edit that index view, or sorry, the login template. Now you'll notice there is one change that I've made here, and that's to add /website/CSS. That just goes back to the website root, which is here, into the CSS folder, and then grabs the bootstrap.css file, and then again on line 14 the same thing, but gets the custom.css file. Now I'm just going to scroll down and find this icon, so I know the icon's above this header here, so we can see that here. I'm just going to pop in /website/. That again goes back to our website directory and then loads in the Bootstrap solid logo. Back to our browser, refresh again, and now everything's all the same. So going back to the point I'm making, if I remove index off here now, press enter. Oh, sorry, I've missed out website in there, so I'll put website back in. There we go. So website/authentication, so controller name again, /index, same thing shows. Get rid of index, same thing shows. So what's happening here is this is the default function or the default method in this controller. So what that means is that no matter what, if I don't give it a function name, so the function name in the browser is this bit on the end here, then it will by default go to the method index. So let me show you another example there. So if I now create another function, so I'm going to call it public function, which means it's publicly accessible to us. And I'm now going to call it register, because that's going to be the next thing we're going to create. So now what I can do is I can return, and I'm going to, in this case, return a view still. But I'm just going to show that standard template again, just to show you how this works. So I'm going to call it a welcome message. Okay, now if I save that, and then what I'm going to do, pop back to my browser, and again, at the minute I'm on index. If I now change index to register, you'll see that I go back to that standard welcome message template file. So the next thing for me now to do is just to change this register template. So again, I can go back into my controller code, into the register function, and I'm going to change this now to load the register file. So the register file I've just created, very similar to the login template, except for the buttons say register rather than login, and the top of the form says application registration. So I've now saved that, so you can notice that the asterisk is gone. So if I press a space, you can see I've got an asterisk there, and I've also got the save disk available. If there are no changes or you've saved them, you can see that asterisk goes, so does the save disk if you're using Notepad++. So now I've made that change, pop back into my browser, I'm going to refresh the register form, and you can now see I've got an application registration. From here, the next step is to make sure that what's happening when I make changes in this form is that the information is sent to Codeigniter for me to deal with it. So by deal with it, I mean to insert it into the database or to grab the information so I can deal with it in some sort of manner in the application. So I'm going to do that in the HTML for this template. So I'm going to go back into my views folder. I'm going to edit the register template, which again has got a PHP extension. And inside here, I'm going to tweak this because I missed it. So I'm going to change that to registration. I'm then going to just tidy up some of the indentation because this is quite messy just now. So I'm going to grab everything inside the body. I'm going to press Shift and Tab in Notepad++ to bring everything back to the left-hand side. So you can press that multiple times. So now you can see everything's touching the left of the file. I'm going to leave everything highlighted, let go of Shift and press Tab to indent it once. I'm now going to go and click my form tag. You can see I've got my opening tag and my closing tag. Select everything inside that form. I'm going to indent it. I'm then going to work through all of the divs again to make sure that everything inside of those is indented correctly. So the rule of thumb is that everything inside a div should be indented by 1. Anything inside a container again should be indented by 1 to end up with some nice tidy code. So this is it. This is a nice tiny bit of code now, which we're ready now to work on. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure that all of our form fields have what's called a name tag. Now the name tag is picked up via a post method. So as soon as I click the submit button, I click to post the form, then the data is collected via these name tags. So each input that we're collecting data from needs to have a name tag. So in this case, I'm going to add a name tag onto my username, and I'm just going to match the name with the ID. This doesn't really matter as long as you remember what it is. So I've added in the tag name, and I've given it the name input username. I'm now going to grab this, paste it below, and just change it to input password for the password field. And that's all I've got on this form just now, so that's all the only fields that I need, nice and simple. Once I've done that, the next thing I need to do is just tweak this form tag itself, and there's two things I need to add to this. So one is the method, which should always equal post in capitals. So the next thing I need to add is also an action. So action is going to be where we're going to send this information to when we click the register button. So the best thing to do is usually just to put a /, and that means it's going to post back to the exact same location. We can also leave it blank. So I'm going to pop it as a / just now. So now if I go back to my form in the browser, I'm going to refresh it. Nothing should change because there's nothing visual that's been changed in that template file. And now what I'm going to do is just pop in a username. So I'm going to put Mark Nurick. I'm going to give myself a password, so it's just password in this case, and I'm going to click register. Okay, so it is asking me for an @ symbol, and that's because I've left the fields and email address. So if I just pop back into my code, I'm going to change the username from type email to type text. So sorry about that. Back in the browser, refresh, pop in these details again. I'm going to click register. Okay, and you can see it's come back to localhost. Now again, this is one of the issues of using WAMP. So what I'm going to do is just tweak that path slightly back in this form. So where I've got my action, I'm going to say action /website /authentication /register. So this is going to give me the full path back to the register form. Back to my browser, I'm going to go back to the register form, refresh it so I make sure I get the latest HTML. I'm then going to pop in my username, Mark Nurick again, followed by my password. And I'm going to click register. And you can see nothing's changed, but it has cleared the form and it's come back to the same location, which is what we want. We can now go into our controller and deal with this and see what we're actually sending the server. So I'm going to pop back into my controller now, and what I'm going to do is look for some data that's been sent to me when I click the register button. So I'm going to pop into my authentication controller here. I'm going to go into the register function. Now I always need to display this view, so I'm going to leave that in place. I'm just going to comment it. So this is going to show the register form. Remember to get into the habit of commenting your code all the time, it keeps it nice and tidy. And then above this is where I'm now going to handle what's going to happen when someone clicks that register button. Okay, so there are different ways you can do this. I'm going to use standard PHP because it'll be easy to get your head around for starters anyway. So what I'm going to do is write a simple if statement. Good way to write your if statements to start with the word if. open your standard brackets like so, and then open some curly braces as well. Inside your brackets is where we're going to do our conditions. So we're going to check for a username and a password being sent. Now the reason why we do this is because there's no point accepting a post request if we don't have the information we need to log into the system. Otherwise you can get into a situation where you have silly requests being sent to your server, which your server then has to deal with. So in this case, I'm going to check that I have some post information set for my input username, which is what we called it in the name tag, remember earlier. And I'm also going to check that I have an input password being sent, which means that we have both a username and a password being sent to the server. So again, input password in this case. Okay, and that's the end of my if statement for the time being. Inside this, I now need to deal with that data, so I'm going to use Codeigniter's way of dealing with this. So this is the latest revision of Codeigniter, remember, so Codeigniter 4. So in order to deal with the data, I'm going to collect the request information using a request command. So I'm going to say /config, /services, and then I'm going to get the request, like so. So this is standard Codeigniter syntax in the latest version, so you will get used to this. But now we've got it written, you can use it again and again and copy and paste this line and use it where you need it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect the username and password into variables. So I'm going to create a variable with the $ symbol called $username. I'm going to get the request data, and I'm looking for the post information of input username in this case. I'm going to duplicate that line, use Ctrl-D in Notepad++. Again, there might be similar commands in other editors. Oh, I've missed an equals here. So I'm going to pop those equals in. I'm going to change this to collect the password, and I'm going to change it where it says input username to input password. Now just to show you what's happening here, what I'm going to do is just output this onto the screen. So I'm going to say echo username, and I'm also going to say echo password. Okay, so now if I go back to my login screen, I'm going to pop in my username, which is just Mark Nurick. I'm going to pop in the password, and I'm going to click register. And we can see that I now get this information on here. So it now says Mark Nurick, and it also says password. So that's what's being sent to the server. Now, not a very good way or very eloquent way of dealing with it. So we're going to do something slightly different with this. And what we're going to do now is link into a model which is going to connect to our database and make sure that this username and this password actually exists. So the next step for me is to go in and create an authentication model. So if I go back to my file structure, back into app, and then into models, and then what I'm going to do is create a brand new file in here which is going to be called my authentication model. So to do that, I'm just going to create a new text document for the time being. I'm going to change the extension to PHP, and I'm going to call it authentication also. Okay, so I'm going to allow me to change that file extension again. That's just a warning. So say yes. I've now got a PHP file called authentication. I am actually going to rename that again and just call it authentication model, just so it's a bit clearer what type of file that is. I'm going to go inside that now and I'm going to edit it, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to now create the outline for my file. So the outline for my file will look something like this. So I need to start the file with a PHP tag. Please do not ever use shortcode PHP. So for example, that would be shortcode for opening PHP. It's just lazy coding, and also some server versions have issues reading that tag. Now, another important note here is that we do not need to close that PHP tag. So normally at the end of a PHP file, you would close or end your PHP code with a question mark and then a more than symbol. Say that's the end of the PHP code. In Codeigniter, we don't need to do that. So don't ever put that at the end of the file either. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to say that this is going to be a model. So we're going to add in the namespace app and models. Now what the namespace means is just this is where the file lives. So it lives in the app folder and it lives inside the models folder. The next thing we're going to do is use the standard Codeigniter model template, which is set up for us. So we're going to say Codeigniter /model. and then we're going to start our class as normal. So again, this is just going to be a class, and we're going to create an object from it when we want to use this authentication model. So we're going to say class, we're going to match this name with the file name, so it's authentication model, and then we're going to extend it from the standard Codeigniter model setup, and then close our curly brace to end up with a class. Inside this are some key things we need to add, and this is new based on the latest version of Codeigniter. So the first thing we're going to do is add some information based on the table and the database itself. So in this case, again, we're working with some users information, so we're going to be working with the users table in our database. So we're going to create a protected variable, we're going to call it table, and we're going to be looking at the users table. We're now going to add in a couple more standard things which need to be in this controller this model in order for us to deal with the data. So we're going to add in the primary key, which is the unique identifier for this table. We're going to add in a return type. Now there are multiple different return types. I'm going to be using array because I find it easier, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be at this stage. I'm also going to add in a parameter called allowed fields. Now this is something new in Codeigniter 4, along with the other parameters actually, but this thing actually is quite key to us in that it allows us to enable additional security on our database tables. So in this case, what we're going to do is in some square brackets, we're going to add in the fields that we're allowing the user to edit or grab information from the database. So in this case, it's just going to be the field's username and password, which we created in MySQL Workbench earlier. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to write our create user function. So we're going to start off with public because we're going to be able to access it from other files and not just the authentication model itself. We're going to create a public function. We're going to call it create user, and inside that, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in some user information, which is going to be in the form of an array. So I'm going to call that array user information. Now that's nothing important just now. There's nothing there. There's nothing being sent to that. That's just what we're going to call it. It's nice and simple, and it means that we understand what information is coming into this function. Now inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to write an insert statement. Now Codeigniter uses its own database logic system called Active Record, so you can have a look at their documentation for this. The latest version of Codeigniter, the documentation isn't quite up to scratch just now, but I'm going to show you the standard queries anyway, and you'll get used to them as you begin to develop with Codeigniter. So I'm going to say this, which is in the context of the current object once it's been initialized. I'm going to say this, insert, and then I'm going to add some standard brackets, and inside those some square brackets, and then a semicolon to end that statement. Inside there, what I'm going to do is say I'm going to be inserting information into the username field in that table, and I'm also going to be inserting information into the password field in that table. So just to show you where these map, if I pop back into my MySQL Workbench, I've got my username field and my password field, so that is all they are. They need to be named exactly with the same casing. So in this case, username with lowercase. In the case of password, again, password, no uppercase P or anything in there. So I've now got my username and password. Inside here, I'm going to collect some information from the user information array, which we set up just before. So this is where it's passed in as a parameter into the function. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to grab the username. I'm going to just grab this and duplicate it just below, and I'm going to use that again. However, this time I'm going to be wanting to grab the password. Now at this stage, what we're going to do is we're going to look to encrypt this password. Your password should never be stored in plain text, so we're going to start and do that straight away. So for this, we're going to use the password hash function, which is part of standard PHP. We're going to use the user information still, so we're going to leave that in there. After that parameter, we're going to put a comma, and we're going to put in password underscore default, all in capitals. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to use the default encryption standard, which I believe is bcrypt in the latest version of PHP, and it's going to encrypt whatever I enter in here now. So if I enter the word password, when I view it in the database, it won't be seen as the word password, it'll be encrypted, so it won't be visible up in plain text or readable to a human. I'm now going to save this file. I'm going to pop back to my controller I'm now going to load this model into my controller so that I can do something with it. So that in the case of doing something with it, what I mean is I'm going to be able to save some data to my database. Okay, so in here, what I'm going to do is now load this model. So to do that, I'm going to say $auth model, which is just the name that I want to give it. You can call this whatever you want. You're going to use this throughout. So this is just class initialization into an object. So I'm going to say auth model equals new /app /models, which is where the model's located, /authentication model, open close some brackets and put a semicolon on. So this is now going to load our model. We'll comment this saying this will load the authentication model. Okay, and that's it now loaded. So we can do what we want with this. Now what I am going to do is just move this outside of this if statement just so it's loaded straight away. So I'm going to grab this, Control X, pop it just above the if statement here. There you go. So I've not done anything special, I've just moved it outside of the if statement. Okay, I'm going to get rid of some of this blank space. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this method now to save the information into the database. So you'll notice if I pop back to my model, what I had was an array called user information. Now what that means is when I call create user, I need to pass in some information and it's going to come through into the function in the array name user information. So in my controller I'm going to give it the same name just to keep things nice and clear. So I'm going to create a new array called user information. So this is just the standard way of creating an array in PHP. I'm going to create two elements inside that array, one called username, so this is just a key value array or key value pair. I'm going to call it username, and I'm going to use now my username parameter which I collected earlier in the file, which is here. I'm going to duplicate that line, and I'm now going to pass in password. And again, I've got the password saved in $password. So now what I've got is an array with the username and the password stored inside it. So I'm going to say that this is an array with the new user information. That's it. Now that I've got this set up, I'm now going to call my method inside my model. So to do that, I've got an object called auth model here. So I'm going to say $auth model, and I'm going to say create user, which is what I called the function. And I'm going to pass in my array of information, which again I call user information, like so. So this is now, I'm going to call the model and save the new user's information. Okay, nice and simple. Once I've done that, I'm just going to remove these out of here because we no longer need those. And at the minute what's going to happen is nothing really on the screen. All I'm going to see is the same register form again, even when I save this information. But I'm just going to show you this working. So if I pop into my database, I'm going to just refresh this data. So you can see there's nothing in there. There's no users, there's no passwords. I'm going to click in to my browser. I'm going to refresh this form without the data in there, like so. I'm now going to register a user called Mark Nurick with the password. Okay, click register. Okay, it says whoops, we seem to have hit a snag. So the reason why it's saying that we've hit a snag is because we haven't actually told our application to use the database yet. So the next thing we need to do is tell our application that we want it to connect to our local database. So to do that I need to go back into the app folder. I need to go into the config directory and then edit a file in here called database, which is just here. So I'm going to edit that file, and then inside here I'm going to scroll down to line 35, which asks me for my database username. So in this case it's just root. Remember, we don't have a password, but we do have a database name which was just called website. Okay, so I'm going to save that file once I've made those changes, close it, return back to my browser and refresh. It's going to ask me if I want to resubmit the data, which I do. Click continue, and you can now see that I come back to the application registration screen. So again, remember I said previously that we aren't going to see anything change on the screen, but we are going to be able to refresh the database and see that information in there. So if I pop back to MySQL Workbench now, refresh the data, and you can see I now have a username, which is Martin, and I have an encrypted password. So it's a nice simple way to insert data into your database, in this case to create a user. So you can use this for anything that you need to for inserting data. Obviously the only difference is that we've used the password hash function to encrypt the password. So we are going to come back to this register form at some point and just change the functionality slightly, so when we do register it shows us a success message or something similar to that. However, in the meantime what we're going to do is just pop back to our forms or to our controller itself and create the login functionality. That means that by the end of this tutorial you should have both your registration and your login functionality working. So in order to do that we're going to pop back to our controller, which is called the Authentication controller here. Now in this case what we're going to do is we are going to recycle some of this code. So what I mean by recycle is that some of it can be used exactly how it is. Okay, so the information that we're going to recycle just now is going to be both our request for get post input username, input password, and also the loading of the model, because we're going to use that to check that we've logged in. So I'm going to grab this, I'm going to go above my login function inside index, paste that in. I'm just going to close off my if statement, so you can see it's opened on this line here on 11 and then closed on line 16. And then what I'm going to do now is deal with this data. So the next thing we need to do is to check that that user actually exists in the database. So to do that we're going to create a specific user check. So it's going to check the database to make sure that user actually exists. So I'm going to use the auto model for this. I'm going to use a function which I haven't yet created in my model called getUser, and inside there I'm going to pass in both the username and the password. Okay, so this is going to check that they exist. I'm now going to pop into my authentication model and create that function so that I can actually use it. So back into my authentication model, create a new function called getUser. Remember that accepts two parameters, one called username and one called password. And then inside there, what I'm going to need to do is to run what's called a getWhere query. Okay, so I'm going to write a variable name. I'm just going to call it query because it's nice and simple. I'm going to use this object or this current context as we're using the auth model to do this. I'm going to run a getWhere query using again Codeigniter's active record syntax. And inside here I'm going to check for where the username equals the username that I've given the system, which is passed in as a parameter called $username, which is here. Okay, so you can see how these match. So we're passing the parameter, we're checking the database using a getWhere query, which is Codeigniter is going to write all the MySQL for me, and we're going to match it to see if it actually exists. After that, what we're going to need to do is return a result. So we're going to pass the result into a variable called $result, and we're going to look for just a single row result. So a single row just means we're looking for one person, we're not looking for any other data in that table. So to do that, we're going to say query, which is matching with this variable name here. We're going to say query get row array, and that's it. So that's going to give us information back. So if I was to run this query now, what I would see is I'd see the result come back and it would display me both the username and it display me a hash value password. So if I pop back to MySQL Workbench, I'd see this information come out onto the screen for me. So back into my model. In order to verify this password is correct, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if, and then inside the if statement itself, I'm going to use the password verify function. So password underscore verify, which is just the opposite of password hash. It's a standard PHP function, and it'll allow me to check what I've entered in plain text. So when I've tried to log in, if I've entered the word password, it's now going to check this against the password hash or the encrypted password in the database. So I've passed in the password in a variable called password, and then what I'm going to do is look to check it against the result that the database has returned me. Now the reason we're doing this is because you can't unencrypt a password. It's one-way encryption, but we can get something that matches it. So we can check our plain text passwords, the PASSWRD, against the version that's in the database here. So I'll just check all my if statements in place, which it is. And now what I'm going to do is, if the password does match and the username exists in the database, I'm simply going to return a Boolean response, so true or false. In this case true, because the password and the username exist and they match, which means that I've successfully logged in. That is it for my model at the moment. Popping back to my controller, what I've now got in specific user is a true or false response. So if the user doesn't exist, I'm not going to get a response, I'm going to get false. But if they do exist, I'm going to get true. To check this in PHP, I'm going to write in an if statement, and I'm simply going to put specific user inside that, which is going to give me true. So a standard if statement like this, I could also check to make sure it equals true, like so. But I'm going to keep it nice and simple, because this will give me the same response anyway. So if whatever's in here is true, in this case specific user, it's going to run the code inside the if statement. So the next thing I'm going to do is create what's called a session. Now a session will allow me to retain a login. So by retain a login, I mean you log in once and then your system knows that you're logged in, so you don't have to log in to view every single password protected page. So to do this, I'm going to load Codeigniter sessions library. And to do that, I'm going to create a variable called session. You can call it whatever you like. Nice and simple to call it session, because then we know what it is. I'm going to look in config, services, and I'm going to load the session library, like so. I'm now going to create some user data. So what I mean by user data is to see whether we're logged in or not, which is just going to be PHP array, which is created like so. Inside that information, I'm going to have their username. I am not going to store their password. The reason why I'm not storing the password is because the session is actually visible. So storing the password would mean that someone can view that session if they manage to get onto your machine or get hold of any details from your machine. I'm also going to store just a Boolean parameter called logged in. And because we know the user's logged in by doing this check here, so it's true, I'm just going to set this straight to true, like so. And I'm now going to set this session into the browser and into the database so that it's saved. So I'm going to use session, which is my variable I set up here. I'm going to say set, which is the method that I need to use to set the data, and I'm going to pass in the user data array, which is here. Once they're logged in, what I'm going to ask the system to do is to redirect them somewhere else. So in this case, I'm going to redirect them back to the home page just to show you that something has actually happened. So to do this, I'm going to use a return. I'm going to say redirect, and I'm going to say to, and it's going to be to website / and that's it. That's going to take me to the home page of this website or this application. So redirect me to the home page. Okay. Now there is one other thing we're going to need to do to this application in order to get sessions to work properly, and that is to change where the sessions are stored. So to do that, we need to pop back into our app folder, into our config folder, and then we're looking for an app file here. We're going to edit this app file. We're going to scroll quite a way through it, pretty much right down to the bottom, and we're going to change how this is stored. So the first change we're going to make is to how the session driver, or which session driver we're actually using. So in this case it's file handler, which means your session is going to be stored in a file on your server. So what we're going to do in this case is we are going to change this to be database handler, because we want to store the session in the database. So we're going to call it database handler, like that. But I'm going to tweak the name of the cookie, and I'm going to change that just to mmcookie. The reason why I'm changing that is just because every Codeigniter app, if we leave that in place, is going to have the same cookie name. So it's just nice to have a different name there. So you can call it whatever you want, but good practice not to leave it exactly what it's called. The next thing we're going to do, because we're storing this in a database, is change line 187, which is where it's going to save this session to. So in this case, write path is going to be a writable folder on the server, but we want to store it in the database. So we're going to get rid of the write path and the period. We're going to change where it says session to CI_sessions, which is the standard table name 4 sessions in Codeigniter. Again, you can tweak this, it doesn't have to be the same as this. In order for us to store this data in the database, we need to create a new table. Now, this information comes as part of Codeigniter's documentation online. So I'll just show you very quickly the web page. So here we go. So in here it says that we have a MySQL code here. So this is what we need to run in our database. So I'm just going to grab that code, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to go into MySQL Workbench, and remember we've already set this as our default database or default schema. So I'm going to delete this code out of here, paste it into there, and click the lightning bolt, which then runs the code. Now you can see it has ticked down here, and if I now refresh my tables, you'll see I've got a CI sessions table. So going back to this, I've made all the changes in here, so I can close this now. And then what I can do is go back to my browser, go back to login. Okay, so we'll just double check our controller code just to make sure we finish with everything. So we did, so we said what's going to happen when we log in and the user exists, we're going to redirect back to website. So back into our browser, I'm going to log in, username was Mark and the password was just password. Okay, and again, what I've done here is just left the incorrect field type on that login form. So I'm going to go back into that form, inside my app views folder. I'm going to edit this login form, and I also actually need to add in the form parameters at the top of the form. So again, I'm going to tidy up this code very quickly. Going to go and grab all the code inside that form and indent it, and then indent everything inside these divs, like so. Okay, and then we end up with a nice bit of code there again. So again, I need to add in the name parameters. So in this case, we're going to call it input username. And the issue that we're having with the validation is that this was email, so we'll change that to text. I'm going to grab this name tag, put it on the password, and I'm going to call it input password. I'm then going to add in my method, which equals post, and my action, which equals website/authentication, which is where my login functionality is. Once I've saved that, I'm going to pop back to my browser, refresh it without any post data, try and log in again. We'll just wait for it to connect to the database. There you go, and you can see it has actually redirected me to /website, which means I have had a valid login. However, my redirect isn't quite right because it's going to localhost. So let's have a look at that. We have actually been redirected where we told it to go. However, what we need to do is just tweak a couple more settings in the app itself to make sure it's redirecting to the correct location for us. So we're going to pop back into the app folder. We're going to go into config, into app again, and then right at the top you'll notice that we have a base URL. Now, because we're using WAMP, we do need localhost, but we do not need the port number on there, so we're going to get rid of that, and then we're just going to save that file. We're then going to pop back into our browser. We're going to go back to our login screen, which is website/authentication, like so. We're then going to pop in our login details again, so Mark equals the username, and password was the password. I'm then going to click sign in, and then now you can see in this case we have actually signed in and we've gone to /website, which has displayed the main screen for us again, so the welcome message. Okay, so that is us now logged in. Now what I have done in the background is just gone into my settings inside Chrome. So you can see I've got my settings tab up here open now, and inside here I've looked for the cookie just to make sure it is setting the cookie, which can prove that we're logging in. So remember we called that cookie MN cookie in my example, and you can see it has actually been set up, which means the login has been accepted. So that's it for today. What we're going to do later on in a couple more videos is we're going to look at refining this login system, refining the registration system, and protecting multiple areas of our application with it. So thanks for watching, and check back to see some more content again soon.